So as you likely know, every Easter, churches across the globe tell the story of Jesus' resurrection. Each year we have 4 different accounts to pick from, one in each of the 4 Gospels. The tomb is empty in all 4 of them, spoiler alert, and in all 4, it's women who discover it and share the news. But there are differences in the details from gospel to gospel. One of those different details in Luke's gospel that Neil just read is that when the women bring the astounding news of Jesus' resurrection and angels and bright lights and all of this information, the other disciples just ignore them. You know, in the translation Neil read, it said they thought it was nonsense. In other translations, it seemed to them like an idle tale. We're told that the group rejecting the account included the 11 of Jesus' closest 12 disciples who remained. If you remember, we lost Judas as he took his life a few days earlier. So there are 11 left, all of them, well, all but one, an idle tale. But there were others there too, simply labeled all the rest. But despite the broad dismissal, there was one who dared to consider what the women had told them, to allow for a sliver of hope. Perhaps because out of all of them, he was the one who most needed that story to be true. Peter, the one whose betrayal of Jesus likely cut deeper than even the betrayal of Judas. Peter, one of the 3 closest disciples to Jesus from the very beginning of his ministry, the one who Jesus named a rock on which the Church of Jesus Christ would be built, the one who bragged about how far he would go with Jesus, do anything, go anywhere, and then denied 3 times even knowing him when Jesus was arrested and Peter's own hide was on the line. The third of those 3 denials was made within Jesus' hearing, just before Jesus' flogging began. And just 2 chapters before the passage that Neil read, Luke gives us one of what I think is the most searing lines in all of the Bible. Luke 22, verses 60 and 61. So Peter's been talking, he's denied Jesus twice. And here comes the 3rd time. And Peter said, "Man, I do not know what you were talking about." At that moment, while he was still speaking, the cock crowed. The Lord turned and looked at Peter. I don't think I would have survived that look. Nope. Luke tells us Peter went out and wept bitterly. And I imagine he did. I imagine he was still weeping bitterly as he hid in that room with the others on Easter morning, for he also hadn't had the courage to go out and be at the cross when Jesus died. Maybe he feared for his life, or maybe he feared another look from the one he loved so much and yet had still betrayed so unforgivably. The one who most needed the account of the women to be more than just an idle tale was Peter. And he got up and he ran to the tomb to see for himself. The need for hope, the need to find some reason to go on with his life, to see a light at the end of the tunnel that for once wasn't an oncoming train, made him put all concerns for his own safety aside and go see if the news was perhaps true. If there was, by some miracle, a way for him to atone for the damage he had done to the one who had plucked him from his fishing nets and given him a new calling and new purpose in life above anything that he could possibly have imagined. The story of the women kindled hope in Peter. And on the wings of that hope, Peter flew to the tomb and found it just as the women had told him. Peter's Easter story resonates with me this year, and perhaps with many of you. As the world seems to kind of spin out of control, it's easy to become overwhelmed and lose in that overwhelm the one thing that can change, if not our circumstances, then at least our chance of finding some way through them. And that thing is hope, which Emily Dickinson called, what? That thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. That thing with feathers was somehow still perched in Peter's soul. And as he heard the idle tale of the women, he suddenly found that the words of the idle tale matched the tune in his soul. And he took flight to see if the tale could possibly be true. I don't think it's an accident that one of the forms the Holy Spirit takes in the Bible is a dove, a bird, a thing with feathers that perches in our soul and never stops singing. But the tune the Spirit sings doesn't have words, until, from the words of even an idle tale, there is suddenly a match, and we take flight to find its source. A few months ago, I came across, no, I don't want to put in my password. Jeez, don't you know it's Easter? So a few months ago, I came across what seemed like an idle tale, but its words matched the tune that never stopped singing in my soul. And so I'm sharing it with you this morning because when I flew to its source, it cried, "Easter! This is the hope of Easter." And so I filed it away for this morning. The story begins in 1956, when a small group of conservation workers in Canada wanted to raise awareness about the near extinction of whooping cranes. To make their point, they wrote a skit that dramatized the annual 2,600-mile migration of a pair of whooping cranes from the Gulf Coast in Aransas, Texas, to Wood Buffalo National Park in Alberta, Canada, the second largest national park in the world. The skit then aired over Canada's public radio, the CBC. An 8-year-old boy in rural Nova Scotia named George Archibald was listening to the CBC that day in his one-room schoolhouse. Learn about the cranes. Already devoted to ducks and peafowl and pheasants and chickens and geese and pigeons, which he cared for dutifully in his own yard, young George heard the dramatization about the whooping cranes with alarm. As the Houstonian magazine described the skit in their February 2020 issue, quote, "The birds had just arrived at their summer home up north," the announcer explained, before piping in the sound of helicopters. "Help! They've found us!" the talking whoopers cried. "They're going to shoot us and put us in a museum collection." Although the skit ended with the assurance of one crane to his mate that they were going to be safe because they were nesting on government-protected land, young George's heart pounded as he became one with the whooping cranes in their plight. At 8 years old, he found his calling. George grew up, went on to earn a PhD in ornithology at Cornell University. And in 1973, he and classmate Ron Sowie set up shop on Sowie's family property in Baraboo, Wisconsin, to save the cranes. Whooping cranes for sure, but they knew that at least 5 species of Asian cranes also were threatened with extinction. And then 3 years later, 1976, George heard about a problem with a female whooper named Tex. Going back to the Houstonian article, and this is going to be an extended quote for a while to tell this story. Quote, Whooping cranes were once plentiful along the Texas coast. But by the 1930s, development and the popularity of the crane's long feathers used to adorn hats had nearly wiped them out. There were only 16 members left in the very last wild flock, all descendants of a group that had been wintering in Aransas and summering in the Northwest Territories of Canada since the Ice Ages. President Franklin Roosevelt interceded in 1937, creating the Aransas National Wildlife Refuge to protect them, but bringing their numbers back was an uphill battle. Over the following decades, efforts were made to rebuild the wild flock. Scientists also took some birds, including Texas parents, into captivity to study them and try to preserve the species that way. When she was born in the San Antonio Zoo in 1967, the same year the U.S. put out its first list of endangered species, which included whooping cranes, Tex represented hope for the future, as she held precious strains of genetic diversity, a crucial thing considering that by then the flock had shrunk in size to the point that the few remaining wild birds were as closely related as the Habsburgs. I love that detail. The moment Tex reached maturity, ornithologists started introducing her to attractive potential mates, but she just wasn't interested. Tex had spent the first formative weeks of her life with people, not whoopers, and had zero interest in her fellow cranes. She would come alive performing her part of the whooper mating dance whenever people were nearby. By 1975, breeders had only managed to get her to lay a single egg, which never hatched. Pondering how Tex responded to people, Archibald had an idea. She only wanted to dance with humans. So I thought, well then, let's dance with her. He had her sent out to his foundation in Baraboo just before the spring of 1976. And when she arrived, he set up a desk and a cot alongside her enclosure. Archibald recalls, it was very easy because nobody had ever paid attention to her before, since they were trying to get her to connect with one of the cranes. When I paid attention, she finally had her human. He spent days working alongside her. Soon Tex had a signal. She would lift her beak, exposing her long white feathered throat and emit a soft thrumming purring sound. That meant it was time to dance. Archibald would flap his hands and crouch down and take great leaping steps, all in the hope of connecting with Tex and triggering her ovulation. In his mind, in those moments, he was a bird. While the pair hopped about and flapped wings, a technician would sidle up ready to inseminate Tex. I was there from sunup to dusk every day from March to May. It was great fun and good exercise, he says. I enjoyed her company. Her life was very simple, maybe a little boring for some, but I never got bored. Still, I'm still in the article here, still the next few mating seasons came and went without Tex becoming a mother. She could pick Archibald out of a crowd, refused to dance with anyone else. Then in June 1982, after 6 years, it finally happened. Tex laid an egg. The hatchling, gee whiz, pecked his way out of the avocado-sized brown speckled shell and lived. The story made national headlines, and a local TV station's footage of Archibald's annual Dancing with Tex aired around the country. Remember, this is 82. When one of Johnny Carson's producers, Shirley Wood, rang up and asked Archibald to fly to Los Angeles to appear on the show, he thought of all the millions of people who would surely be watching, and he shuddered. But then he thought of the exposure and the good Tex's story had already done by rousing interest in whooping cranes, and he said yes. Before flying to LA, he said goodbye to Tex, who came out and danced her little pen. Unbeknownst to Archibald, it would be the last time he saw her. That night, the eve of the Carson appearance, a pack of raccoons broke into some of the bird pens. The hatchling, gee whiz, was fine, but Tex was killed. After some debate, Archibald's colleagues called and told him what happened. Archibald, already nervous, had been reading his Bible when the phone rang. As he absorbed the news, his eyes fell on a passage, it comes from John 7:38, that stated that streams of living water would flow from anyone who had faith. Hanging up the phone, he scribbled the verse on a scrap of paper and he stuck it in his shoe. That afternoon, Archibald arrived at the studio lot where he sat in the makeup room with Carson and his sidekick, Ed McMahon, if you remember them, listening to them crack jokes. Archibald tried to laugh along with them, but his mind was skittering from thought to thought. He'd already been a little worried about how this story would play out. It is an odd story. And Carson was a comedian. I was worried he'd use it to make a fool out of me, he said to the reporter, that he'd turn it into a joke. I prayed about it a lot. The segment started out light with Carson setting up the conversation about the ornithologist's years spent dancing with Tex. Archibald described his special relationship with the crane, and then he revealed her fate, and the audience gasped. As he told the reporter, it was a powerful moment, a powerful metaphor. I think Tex touched more people with her death than she did with her dance. More than 22 million people were watching, and I think a lot of them felt that loss. I was sad we'd lost her, but peace came over me. She'd done her work. She'd left us gee whiz, and her story still touches people. That's the end of the Houstonian article. On this Easter morning, I would say that it isn't just Tex's story that touches people. It's George Archibald's story. When Archibald appeared on Johnny Carson, it was an interesting story, but it was not yet a success story, far from it. Tex had just been killed, and gee whiz, who had barely been hatched, was the only offspring in 6 years. No one could say then, in 1982, that because George danced with a whooping crane 15 hours a day for several months in each of 6 years and finally got one egg, that the whooping crane population was going to recover. What the Houstonian article doesn't mention is that even the egg containing gee whiz almost didn't make it. All of Tex's eggs had been deformed, including the one containing gee whiz. Once they discovered a chick inside, they rushed to try to save the egg. It was severely dehydrated, and they managed to figure out a way to rehydrate the egg. When gee whiz was hatched, he was dangerously underweight, and he was nursed with a tiny little feeding tube to get him to a point where he could live on his own. But he did. Across 4 decades, gee whiz became the patriarch of a family of 178 genetically diverse whooping cranes. The number in the flock that migrates from Texas to Canada, whose plight inspired the creators of the CBC radio skit, went from 16 to over 500. And through the work of what became the International Crane Foundation, under the faithful and fearless leadership of George Archibald, new cohorts of whooping cranes are being established, and the total of all flocks now number over 800. Through George's efforts, Similar reintroduction projects were taken for other endangered crane species in South Korea, the former Soviet Union, Iran, China, Thailand, saving not just individual birds, but habitats and the biodiversity necessary to sustain them. From the International Crane Foundation website, quote, "From our nearly 300-acre headquarters in Baraboo, Wisconsin, our reach extends across the globe. We have offices and staff in China, Kenya, South Africa, Rwanda, Uganda, and Zambia, as well as Texas, and work through strong partnerships with local organizations, governments, universities, businesses, and others in these regions. Our more than 125 staff and associates work with a network of hundreds of specialists in over 50 countries on 5 continents." I hear a lot in these days, "I'm just one person. What can I do?" We've been talking about this for most of the year, from looking at making a covenant of salt to last week's exploration of faithfulness. Find the thing that moves your heart, the thing you love, and give of yourself to serve and protect it as God commanded Adam in Genesis 2:15. Everything is connected to everything else. To save any one piece is to help in saving the whole. George Archibald's story is a microcosm of the Easter story. God became human to save us. George Archibald became a crane to save them. It is fundamentally the same story. George, too, had his Good Friday, and it was in part the death of Tex that created life. If Tex had still lived when George Archibald had that viral moment that landed him on TV with Johnny Carson, the comedian who created the genre of the late-night blend of news and comedy, most of the 22 million people watching would have been amused, but most would likely have heard it as an idle tale, forgotten overnight. Some would no doubt have gone to bed saying to family members, "Wild story. Can you imagine a guy living with a guy who spends months acting like a bird? All for 1 egg in 6 years? Guess it takes all kinds. Shut off the light." But because Tex was killed right before that appearance, an otherwise cute, if decidedly odd story became instead the universal story of giving your all to care for something you love deeply, only to have tragedy suddenly threaten everything that matters. The audience gasped at the news. Everyone watching had some experience with at least the fear of that kind of loss. With Tex dead, 22 million people were suddenly invested in the survival of one little chick, and by extension, the future of a species that some viewers probably didn't even know existed when they had woken up that morning. And perhaps some of those 22 million, as they heard the story, felt the pounding in the heart that George had felt as a boy, when he heard the people pretending to be whooping cranes wail for their lives on a CBC radio broadcast. Maybe they stepped up to help save cranes, or maybe they felt a stirring to save something else. But one thing was certain. What was intended as a fun story about a man dancing with crane turned into a love story with a cliffhanger ending. What would become of little Gee Whiz? How can we help that chick survive? And that is the story every Easter brings us. Peter was the first Gee Whiz, newly hatched with great difficulty and a very uncertain path ahead. And year after year, century after century, millennium after millennium, Easter is still a love story with a cliffhanger ending. By Easter night, John's gospel tells us that Jesus had passed on his earthly job to his disciples, breathing the Holy Spirit into them and saying, as the Father has sent me, so I send you. They did what they could and then passed that job on and on and on until it lands with us. The job to do as he did and to love as he loved. Save the world. Save a crane. Save a country. Save a species. Save a person or a people. Save a tree. Hatch an egg. Become a part of God's love story for the world. For God so loved the world. For George so loved the cranes. For you so love what? Amen.